Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I paint faces using watercolor and gouache. I'm going to start off with mainly my Stone Crowned Paint Co. handmade watercolors. I've got some in this tin that I was sent by the company and some in this tin as well, along with a few colors from other makers such as Autocano, who did these ones in the center, and some from Redwood Willow, and two colors from Jasper Stardust. These are my favorite paints for painting skin tones. I've gotten really used to working with them, and I'm going to show you on these sketches mainly how I paint them in watercolor, because my process for painting them in watercolor is very similar to how I typically paint faces in gouache as well. And then for the fourth and final sketch here, I will use only gouache and explain the differences, of which there probably won't be that many. I work very thinly for faces. It's a way of getting the light to pass through to the paper underneath, and you get sort of a luminosity that you can't get if you cover the whole thing in gouache. Obviously, you can still have wonderful results using very thick gouache, and some artists are really great at that, but this is how I usually paint them, how I paint them for both client professional projects and for myself. So I've already sketched out these faces based on models or actors that I quite like the look of, and there are a variety of skin tones that I'll go through, as well as different age groups and different expressions. First off, I'm going to start with this face over here. This individual is a Chinese model, and I think they just look incredible. So, opening up the watercolor here, I'm going to start with a base of a sort of yellowish tone. So for this one specifically, I'm using Felsite, and this is going to give you that warm, sunny kind of undertone. Sometimes I use pink for the base for people with more of a red undertone, but usually I'll start with either an earth pigment red or an earth pigment yellow. And you can even mix a little bit of blue in that to desaturate it if you need to. Myself personally, I kind of have greenish undertones to my skin. So, you know, people come in all sorts of shades, which makes painting more fun. I really like this Felsite paint. It's, I don't know, it's just so pretty. So if you're in the market for some really nice earth tones, really nice like stone-based earth tones, this Felsite just, love it. So as you can see, I've laid down the first wash already, and I'm already blocking in the shading. Now, these drawings I did from reference, but the paintings themselves I'm doing without reference. So take that as you will, I guess. I'm not looking at a reference for the shading or the colors. That way, you know, it sort of diverges from the reference a little and becomes more of like my own thing, I guess. So you want to get the darks in, and obviously these aren't going to be the darkest darks, right? Because we're working wet into wet, it's going to be a bit messy to begin with. But if you work these tones into the watercolor during the first layer, they blend out nicely, and you end up with some softer variations in the skin tone. And skin is often very, very soft unless your skin's really dry, or, you know, there's some other identifying feature about a person that you're painting. One thing that I've learned from James Gurney in his, I think it's Color and Light, but it could be Imaginative Realism. But basically there are three sections to the face. There's the top or the forehead, and that's usually more yellow toned. There is the cheeks and the nose, and that's usually more of a pink toned undertone. You think about where people blush, it's on the cheeks and the nose. And then below that, on the lower half of the face, you usually want more of a bluish undertone. And that is partly due to, for example, 5 o'clock shadows or things like that. Those are going to appear as a desaturated color. By blue, it's not really like blue, it's more like desaturated. So the desaturation will push these areas of the face backward, and usually your jaw does recede. So that's sort of a way to do it with color. That's actually quite quick. And this is going to look kind of garish to begin with, but I'm going to buff it out basically like you do when applying blush in a makeup routine, basically. I learned a lot about the planes of the face by being really into the beauty side of YouTube. I don't really watch, I don't watch any beauty channels anymore. I've sort of gotten away from that kind of materialism, I guess. And also I explored what I wanted to in terms of beauty and fashion. And I kind of know the products I like now, but before I didn't really know because I didn't wear makeup as a teenager. I had a few things, and I wore makeup for my high school like grad photos, but that was literally the first time I'd been in a MAC store. Like the first time I'd bought lipstick. Me and my gay friend had to go, like he had to take me and be like, this is where you buy lipstick. Like I had no clue. So he was very good about it. He let me buy the lipstick Dark Side, which is pretty vampy, and for someone who'd never really worn lipstick before except for like Halloween makeup, that he let me buy Dark Side. He let me walk out of that store with Dark Side. So if you know that shade, it's vampy, and I kept it for a really long time, but yeah, eventually I had to get rid of it because it was getting really old. Anyway, so while that part is drying, I'm going to block in the base layer for the hair. And I think in this instance, I'm going to use a burnt sienna. This is, I believe, burnt sienna crimson from Stone Ground Paint Co. And this portrait is going to have black hair eventually, but this is going to give the black something to build on and give it more saturation in the end. So right now it still looks pretty plain, but that's the nature of watercolor. I'm going to go back in and start defining some of the darker areas of the portrait, the shadow areas, because with watercolor the lighter areas are basically, they're now done. I can't make them any lighter, so we're just working down to the blacks basically. And of course you don't have to go all the way to black. You can go to a dark gray or blue or brown. But probably for this one I'm going to work down to a color that's a mix of a lamp black, oh actually a bone black and an indigo. So like I said before about the lower portion of the face being sort of more bluish, going cooler in tone will help areas of a portrait recede. So that's why I am working in these bluish tones near the lower half of the face and below the neck. Certain lighting schemes you'll get more of a reflected light along the bottom of the jaw, which will be brighter and warmer. And I'll add a little bit of that in at the end, but not going to worry about it right now. So to work in some of the shadows around the center part of the face, which again should be a little bit warmer, I've mixed just some orange and Venetian red type colors with a buff titanium to neutralize it a little bit, and I'm going to start going in with that and defining the planes around the eyes. And around the forehead. Again, it's going to look weird for a little bit. That's watercolor for you. And one other thing too is that if you're using handmade watercolors like I am, chances are you're going to get more lifting than if you were using more transparent colors. Typically the more professional brands will layer more reliably because they're not changing their formula based on the pigment. They're making all of the pigments behave the same way, whereas handmade paints are a little more artisanal, a little different in how they behave across the entire range, which I like. So I know how these paints are going to change, and I know that at times the felsite can be a bit lifty, so you know, that's fine. I don't really care. Okay, so I've gone and smoothed out some of the edges on this portrait, and it's starting to get to where I'm digging it. So if you do end up with harsh lines that you didn't want, depending on your paper, you can lift them out like I did. This paper is really good for lifting. Some papers stain a lot more easier, and some pigments stain a lot more easier. So obviously this is a tutorial about how I paint faces, but you still have to know how your paints that you like using are going to function. So I'm going to let this dry again completely and then come back in for the darkest darks. Okay, so this bit is basically dry now, and I'm going to put in the dark sections of the painting. So I gotta swirl my brush around in these dark colors quite a bit. They don't re-wet super fast at their full intensity. That's okay. I find that this stage in a portrait is the one where everything like really comes together, because you're putting the definition back into it, you know, that you might have lost along the way. And for hair, I generally try to think of it as big blocks of color rather than individual hairs, and then use the individual hairs as sort of accent shapes. And to get the highlight on dark hair, I just leave it a little more transparent in certain areas. And then more of that underpainting will show through. Now, when I'm painting the eyes on a portrait, I tend to think of them also as just one shape. That is the shadow of the upper eyelid connected to the pupil and the iris. You can leave a little gap to be the specular highlight, or you can come in afterwards and do that with a white paint or a white gel pen. But I find in watercolor that this technique is really nice because it doesn't involve you overworking the eye area at all. You know, it's nice, it's simple, you get it down, it's done. Your face now has eyes, and you're not fussing too much with how they look. Obviously, if you're painting a larger portrait or a larger eye, you're going to have to put some more details in there. But for one about this size, I find that technique works really well. And for the center of the mouth, I always start with the corners of the mouth, like so, and then connect them after that. Now, once you get to this stage, you're going to need to darken a little bit of the portrait back again, just to match the darkness of the darks that you just put in and to get that full value range. But you don't need that everywhere, so usually you're going to need a little more value range around the nose, on the shadow of the upper lip, and around the ears and the eyes. I mentioned earlier the high saturation color that sometimes appears right below the chin, and that's a result of light bouncing back from the chest or the neck. And so this isn't a perfect representation of that, but it sort of gets the feeling across. And then just blend that edge out until you like it. So that's portrait number 1. It's got quite a bit of granulation and natural watercolor texture, but I like that, and this paper really enhances that. So if you're using a smoother paper, you're going to get less of that. If you're using a rougher paper, you'll get more of that. It just depends. This is sort of a very in-between type paper. Like, there's some texture, but overall it's quite smooth. Anyway, so portrait number 1. We'll move on to portrait number 2 now. And this one is an actress who's quite fair-skinned and fair-haired. So we're gonna go really easy on the watercolor for her. We're gonna use quite a lot of this pink tone, a little bit of yellow, a little bit of buff titanium, and a little bit of an earthy red and orange, and we're gonna really blow these out into really watered down layers, as you can see here. So starting with that, we're gonna block in the basic skin tone, which right now looks like I'm painting just water on the page. I promise there's some pigment in there somewhere. But for light skin tones, you have to start light and make sure you don't go too dark, or else it's going to look like you're doing a different lighting scheme than you intended, or it can look muddy. You just have to, you know, keep an eye on it. And I find keeping to the warmer side of things, so the pinks and the reds, they blend out into a really nice white skin tone. Again, the forehead, usually more yellowish, so I'm putting more yellow into that one. And the chin and the neck, a little more desaturated, so I'm not adding blue precisely. I'm adding buff titanium, which is more of a desaturated neutral gray, neutral warm gray. So we get that change in color from the top to the bottom. And as we add in the details, she'll look a little less ghostly, but she's still gonna be quite pale compared to the rest of these portraits. Alright, so that's the first layer for the skin. I'm going to move on to the hair. And what I'm going to use for that is some of that earthy orange mixed with the buff titanium and just a dab of the, I think it's a nickel azo titanium, the light yellow. And So this will prevent the hair from looking too ashy or too unnatural. Rather than using just yellow, I'm using a blend of these colors. And really making sure to put some variation into the first wash, because otherwise it'll look like her hair is made out of lemons, or it'll look too gray. So just gotta get different tones in there during the same wash, push them around, and the rest of the detail will come later, and it'll start to look more hair-like as we add more layers. For her clothes, I'm also just going to do a quick wash of the titanium buff. I'm not really focusing on the clothes today, so we're just gonna block them in. But I find it's useful to sketch portraits with at least a little bit of the shoulders, you know, like a classical bust type thing, because then you are practicing how the head connects to the neck and how the neck connects to the body, rather than just drawing floating heads and then you go to draw a head with a body and you haven't drawn a neck in ages. Yeah, so that's my tip, and that'll do it for the first set of colors, first wash for this one. So for both the shading on the skin and the hair, we're gonna lean a little more into the reddish orangish saturated tones, just a little bit, and start getting some soft shading where we need it, which will help define the nose. As you can see there. And if you find that in a wash that's supposed to be for the shading, if parts of it need to be darker than others, just drop a little more pigment into those areas and then let them dry like that, and that'll give you a really nice subtle shading effect. If you just trust that it's gonna blend out the way that you hope it will, and that way you'll get more of the natural watercolor textures, which I think you should always, you know, be striving to have in watercolors, unless of course you're into photorealism, which I'm not. Now you have a ring of muscles basically at the corner of each mouth. Oh, I think most people only have one, but at each corner of the mouth, right? And an easy way of sort of denoting that without getting too involved is to just put a little bit of shadow right at the corner, just like that. And that gives a little more definition to the mouth and the cheeks that surround them. Now, if you want your character to look a little more weary or tired or sullen or anything like that, you can drop a little bit of a blue tone right beneath the eye, or a lot of one. Depends on what you're going for in your piece. And with ears, you can really get kind of intense with the red if you feel like it, because it's a really it's an area with very thin skin and quite a lot of blood vessels. So you're going to get what's called subsurface scattering quite often on the ear and on the corners of the nose, which will appear as like a really intense red. So this color I know dries a little bit lighter, so it looks like someone kind of punched her in the ear right now, but I promise that's not really the case. It's gonna dry a little brighter. But yeah, you just keep working to define the shapes and the dimensionality. I'm putting a little more pink in her lip color, a bit of Quin magenta, in fact, just a little bit, to sort of make it, give her a bit of lipstick, because some people like to wear makeup, and it's good to know how to paint that too. A little bit more pink there. And again, the eyes are kind of like spooky right now, but we'll get there, I promise. So getting back to the blonde hair, I'm shading it mostly with an orangey brown, and that's because I want sort of a strawberry blonde type. Obviously, if you're painting someone who's supposed to have like platinum blonde, icy hair, you're going to use different undertones. But I want this to be sort of a natural, you know, like natural, slightly reddish blonde. If you want it to be more of a dirty blonde, you're going to get more, going to pick up more desaturated browns for your shading, that's all. So it's just about defining the shadows in the hair and the direction of the hair without getting bogged down in painting tons of little hairs, because human hair is so fine sometimes that it does suit it to just, you know, paint it simply rather than extra complex. Again, depends what hairstyle you're painting, depends what you want it to be about. But I think, for me anyway, something that makes painting portraits enjoyable is making something that looks nice without putting too much effort and consternation into it. I think that there's something to be said for being able to paint somewhat effortlessly, and I'm not saying that my paintings always look like that, but I have the most fun painting when I know that there's a look I'm going for that I can achieve, and then when I get to that point, I just stop. And you don't keep fussing with it, you don't wreck it. One of the hardest things to decide in art is when to stop touching it. So sometimes that's tricky. I don't know if I'm the only one. I probably am not, but I'll watch other artists on YouTube paint and do time lapses, and I'll think halfway through like, wow, this is great, stop there. And they just keep going, and it's like, oh no, like, you wrecked it, you know? From my point of view, me watching you, you wrecked it. And I'm sure people feel like that with some of my stuff, because that's just how it goes. So the eyebrows I'm also keeping quite simple and light, just blending out the edges a little bit. blending it into the shading of the skin, because of course eyebrows, you can see the skin through them. She's getting there. She's getting there. She needs a little bit of a... So here's something I'll show you that I quite like in portraits, and that's to take a very thin blue wash and use that to define the shadows. So this is I believe this is a copper turquoise paint, and it's quite chalky actually. It's basically you're painting with powdered oxidized copper. And you just glaze that where you want things to recede and move back into the background of the painting rather than the foreground. And I'll do that typically around the edges of the face and in the shadows. So I like to do that quite a lot, just as like an extra touch if it needs it. Not every portrait exactly needs it, and some of them, like the first one over here, I used a more a darker, more grayish blue, whereas this one is like, this is copper turquoise, like blue. Now for the darkest bits on the blonde hair, I'm using a warm brown. And again, using it quite thin, lots of water, not very much paint, because you don't want to get too dark too quick when you're painting colors that are locally very light. Now for the eyes, since I'd like this portrait to have blue eyes, I'm going to start that eye shape that I talked about with the blue and get in the iris there. Get in the iris on the other side, and at this point I'll really make sure that they match, you know, as best I can. Make sure she doesn't look like she's looking in two different directions or anything like that. Sometimes it helps to move away from your painting and look from afar and just really make sure. I'm lucky because I can just look in the viewfinder of the camera and see how it's looking. And that's fine, so that's working out okay. Gonna move on to the darks, which in this case, I'm gonna use a mix of indigo and a very dark burnt umber. So that'll be a warmer black than I used in the previous portrait. And then using the very tip of this brush, I don't know if you can see, maybe if I lift it up here, will it focus? You can see that this brush has a very pointy tip, and you can also see that my hands are very wrinkly. But this tip is gonna really help now that we're going in to do the fine details. And that's why I'm using one brush for the entire painting. Because you can just go and do the lightest little thing and define the shape of the top lash line. And this will bleed into the iris shape that we just laid down and add a natural shadow from the top of the eye. Now I will probably leave the eye like that. I'm not going to go in and define the pupil anymore because I like the soft look. But you could definitely let this dry and then go in and define the pupil, but I'm just going to brush in the lower lash line instead. And then using a clean wet brush, feather it out just a little so it's not so harsh. Okay, so that's like the darkest bit. And when you're doing that on someone who has a light skin tone, it's sometimes a bit like, to go in and just put black right on the eye. But you gotta do it. So again, like I did with the process for the first portrait, now I'm going back in to fill out the range of values around the eye. Now that I have the darks in for reference, and I'm going to get the rest of the details of the eyelid and such on there. And now that I've got that in, I kind of think that I went a bit low on the front curve of the eye, so I'm just going to drop a little more of the dark in to lift up the gaze. Yeah, that's a bit better. Okie dokie. Moving on to the other darks that I need to do. Gonna get some dark brown for the nostril. And keep it quite light. You don't want to go overboard on the nose, especially, and this is like, here's an art tip. If you want someone to look youthful and classically beautiful, you have to try to describe the features of the face as simply as possible. So if you think about like John Singer Sargent's Madam X, for example, like her face is so simple when you look at it. So simple, beautiful gradients. It's mostly just the beautiful shape of her profile, and that's it. And you're not adding extra lines, you're not adding extra details, you're just letting that exist. Another good example is how Mobius, the comic artist, draws his pretty women. It's like eyes, lips, and 2 dots for nostrils, and that's it. No extra lines, nothing like that. So simplicity is key when you want to denote youth in an illustrative way. So that's something to be mindful of. I will be painting an older person at the end here, and you'll be able to see the differences there. Again, for the mouth, I'm starting with the corners and then connecting them gently like that. And I'll give her a little bit of a smile, like a lazy smile, because she was looking kind of sad before, or stoned. You're gonna have a little bit of a shadow below the lower lip always, because it's sort of it sticks out a little bit. You got that little curve beneath the lower lip, so make sure you get that in there. You can always blot stuff with your finger. I do that all the time. And then I will take a little bit more of this dark brown and do just a few more passes on the hair here to differentiate it away from the face. because when you have someone with both pale skin and pale hair, there's not much contrast between the actual local value of the hair and the skin, right? They're both pale colors to begin with, so the differentiation is just coming from the actual physical 3D form and the shadows. So that's just what I'm doing here, just popping in a couple more shadows. And I'll pop in one along the neckline of the jacket too, because why not? And I'll just put a little more dark in the ear, of course, because that's, you know, the ear hole. It's pretty dark in there. So I think she's done, keeping it simple. Not gonna fuss too much with the clothes. This one might benefit from a little specular highlight right at the end in the eye, just a little boop dab of gouache, so I'll do that when I get my gouache out. But next we will move on to the next portrait of this smiley guy, and he has quite a dark skin tone, so I'm going to start with a nice warm red underpainting. And the only place I'm not going to put this is on the teeth. And right now it looks a bit ridiculous, but just bear with me, it's gonna work out. Alright, and you know what, while we're here, I'm going to do the underpainting on this last portrait as well, even though I'm going to finish this one in gouache. So this one a little bit more orangey for the underpainting, but it's essentially the same color. They'll dry down to about the same color anyway. Underpaintings tend to take the longest to dry because I put the most amount of water into them. So this way they can both dry at the same time. And that's efficient. Okay, time for those to sit forever. And I'll be right back. Alright, so we're all dry here, and you can probably see that we've gotten desaturated quite a bit from the wet color, but we have all of this really nice granulation and variation within the tone. I'm going to start by blocking in a little bit more of the color variation and the modeling for this guy here, and give him sort of a top-down lighting scheme, so you're going to get the most brightness on the forehead and the bridge of the nose, as well as on the cheeks, because they are lifted by the really nice smile. I am using Stone Ground Paint Co.'s Burnt Sienna Crimson, which is a really nice color, a very red toned brown. I think it suits this portrait quite well. And again, during this wash, dropping down more color where I need the value to get darker. And since this portrait has features some facial hair and some dark hair, I'm not going to worry too much about like preserving that for later, because the dark hair will glaze over top of these dark tones of the skin. So the more you put behind the dark tones, the more luminous and depthy they'll be, and the more interest the color itself will have. So gonna get in here, and again, this will likely desaturate as it dries. That's just the nature of greedy paper sucking up all your colors. And certain papers will do that more than others. I had a couple of teachers in art school who both swore by different paper brands, and whenever I would turn in a piece that was sort of desaturated, they would swear it's the paper choice that I made. It ate my color. You know, pick a different paper. Why did you use Arches? Oh my God. Or why did you use Fabriano? Oh my God. Anyway, so you just gotta accept these things, I think. And as an illustrator, the nice thing about working digitally for me, I mean, because I paint and then I scan all my images and I do all my post-processing myself, I can bring colors back up to the saturation that I want them to be. I can make them match my roughs exactly in Photoshop. So if the color of the paint doesn't turn out exactly how I want it, I still have options. Now I really like the watercolor edges that are appearing around his forehead and at the bridge of his nose, but I want the cheeks to be a little bit softer, so I'm just rubbing out a little bit of the color while it's still wet there. And as for the teeth, I find that with teeth, the best thing to do is to not do too much at all. So they're basically not going to get touched after the sketch. I'm just going to probably block in a very quick bit of like a shadow tone on the side to help them recede into the mouth. Give them that round appearance, just like that. And then a little bit of color I'll add for the gums, and that's gonna be it. So while the face is drying, I'm gonna block in a color for the shirt. I just have to pick what color. I think I'm gonna go with that quinacridone magenta that I was using. I used a little bit in the previous portrait mixed into her lip color, but very subtle. But I think for this one, I'm just gonna give him like a hot pink shirt because that's cool. And because I haven't painted the tips of the collar there, they're gonna stand out from the rest of the shirt. And you won't have to spend a lot of time painting the garment because you've already used sort of a shorthand method to get the pieces of the fabric to stand out from one another. And I like quick little ways of doing things like that. Obviously, if this piece was about the garment, I'd spend more time on it. And one thing too, so while we're painting a shirt, let's talk about clothes a little bit, because clothes are very important to portraits and to figure drawing and stuff like that. I guess I'm a seamstress as well. My grandmother taught me to sew when I was a teenager and when I was a kid. So I learned how to understand patterns and how to cut them out and put them together and stuff like that. I can draft my own patterns now because I have that sort of foundation knowledge. And one thing that adds legitimacy to drawings of clothing is knowing how clothing works, of course. That sort of goes for anything you draw. If you know how it works and how it's put together, you can draw a more detailed and more realistic, believable, truthy sort of drawing than if you don't know. So when you're looking at clothing, look for the seams, look for the tension in the clothes and where the folds pull from. Look for areas of the clothing that are stiffened. Perhaps they're starched or they have interfacing in them, like collars. Perhaps in the case of historical clothing, there's boning included in a gown, stuff like that. So if you're thinking of where the seams would be, where all the constructional, notions and equipment are, eyelets, buttons, zippers, drawing a jacket and then adding some pockets onto it and some zippers and maybe some cuff detailing, that'll make your clothing drawing look way better. And you don't have to put in a lot of effort to it, you don't have to draw everything, but in painting you can suggest it. So I've suggested that the collar is a little bit stiffer, just in the way I've drawn it and the way I've painted it. I gave it a highlight around the edge, which sort of speaks to a bit of top stitching maybe. So stuff like that I think is quite important. So moving back to the portrait, it's mostly dry now except for the chest area, but I'm not going to touch the chest area again. That's basically done. I'm going to use a little bit of a red color. This is a Venetian red, just along the cheeks. And obviously that's dropped in quite intensely, so I've washed my brush and I'm just going to feather that out a bit. Again, this is going to that, the cheek area of the face is the redder part of the face. And also, since he's smiling, maybe he's blushing just a little bit. And if you want to be more dramatic, you can pull that red color up into the cheeks, but I'm just gonna leave it there. Now I'm going to mix some of that Venetian red with a dark brown, in this case a burnt umber dark, to make a nice dark red, and I'm going to lay in the shape of the top lip because it is going to be in shadow compared to the bottom lip. And for the bottom lip then I'm just going to paint below it and define the chin that way rather than painting onto the lip. For more masculine portraits, you can avoid sort of painting the lips too much by leaving them the same color as the rest of the face, and then that will decrease the contrast in the face. I don't know where I saw this, but there's been a few studies whereas you can show a bunch of people the same composite face, and if the contrast is lower, more people will say that the face looks masculine, and if the contrast is higher, for example with lips that stand out and eyes that stand out more, as in the way that you would apply makeup to accentuate your features, more people will answer that the face looks feminine. So obviously, not everyone who looks masculine identifies that way, but when you're painting characters of any gender, You know, you can use the contrast to your advantage to say something about their identity, or perhaps to say something contradictory about their identity, or to play around with identity that way. So you can paint a very masculine figure with very high contrast, and that maybe says something about their personality. One thing that I do sometimes, and for particular characters of mine, even just sketching in my sketchbook, you know, I'll have a feminine character with lower contrast to denote that they're sort of more gender neutral. So things like that. Obviously that's not like, oh, if you have too much contrast, like you look like a girl. That's just judgmental, but it's important to know like where these visual associations come from, because they're very natural. Part of surviving in the wild is looking around and seeing what's out there. So judging people by their faces, whether it's a correct judgment or an incorrect judgment, is just part of human nature, and something that you should know as an artist. So I'm just putting in a little more definition around the eyes and the nose. And I'm also going to put some more definition around the nasolabial folds, which are the smile lines. Because he's smiling, it's important to make the expression look as genuine as you can. And so when you're smiling, your eyes get really squinty, and your face gets a few more wrinkles around the mouth, but fewer wrinkles in the cheek area, because that's sort of lifting and puffing up and stuff. Okay, get a little more of a shadow under the chin there. A little more shadow inside the ears. There's a little definition of the clavicle there. And I'm gonna let all this dry and then come in and start doing some very warm darks. There, I think that's a bit better. So the darks I'm going to mix out of probably just that red and burnt umber dark combination, just leaning more towards the burnt umber. And then we'll finish up this guy. So you can use your brush to suggest different hair textures in the way that you paint without, again, like the other hair that was more of a straight hair featured in this video so far. I find more success in suggesting hair rather than drawing it specifically. And again, if the painting is about the hair, then this may not quite apply to you. But to get sort of a rougher hair texture, I like to use little pouncing motions like this, as you see, and that'll break up the edge of the hair and give you that different hair texture. And I'm basically I'm just painting a solid shape around his head, but the way that I'm painting that shape helps inform the portrait. like so. And now, of course, that we've got that dark in, we're going to need to go around and improve the value range with the rest of the portrait, just like we did with the other ones. But we'll get the darks in so they can dry, and then we'll move back to the finishing touches. And for a mouth where the teeth are showing, either if it's smiling or snarling or anything like that, again, I start with the corners, and then I move in to the gap between the bottom and top row of teeth. And keep the level of contrast sort of lower where the lips are stretched over the teeth. So I'm not going to go in with a black right in the center of the lips, but I'm going to go up around the sides. And to suggest the gums, just a few little shapes in the gaps of the teeth will do that for you, and you don't really have to overdo it, because overdoing it makes it look creepy. If you're looking at someone from far away, you're not going to be focusing on the details of like the gaps between their teeth, unless it's like a cute gap tooth in the front. You only see the gaps between the teeth when you're like really up in your own face in the mirror, which of course you're not going to be with a portrait of somebody, unless again, if that's the point of the portrait and if that's your artistic statement, like draw that creepy teeth portrait if you want. But that's not what I'm doing right here. Yeah, so just marking in the nostrils there. And then the rest of the facial hair is basically approached the same way as the hair. Light strokes with the brush, getting sort of hair texture where I need it, but mostly treating it as a big shape on its own. And I find that, you know, getting into the details like the facial hair and the hair and the eyes, like really brings the portrait together. Like it didn't look done until this dude got his beard, and now it just looks so much better. I think beards are really handsome, so I like drawing them. Yeah, so that's pretty much done. I'm going to do a little bit of a shadow around the shirt again, just to pop it out a little bit more. And you can have a little chest hair, why not? Just a little. Like, why not? That's cute, right? Yeah, that's cute. and some freckles, because anybody can have freckles. All right, and there's that one. I think again I'm going to give a little bit of a specular highlight once I come back in with the gouache for the next portrait. And I'm just going to push the forehead back just a bit because it's coming forward too much now that I've put the hair on there. So this is the same concept as, like, again, in makeup videos. You wanna bronze around the hairline. This is the same sort of concept. Getting the top of the forehead to receive and putting attention back on the facial features. All right, so I think he's done. We'll move on to the next portrait. Okay, so the main colors I'm going to be using, and these are going to be the tubes of gouache that I squeeze out some fresh paint from, are a permanent white. This is a titanium white. I prefer titanium white because I like the opacity that it has. Zinc white is a little warmer and a little more transparent. So a lot of people ask, like, what's the difference between permanent white and zinc white? Permanent white is more opaque and tends to desaturate colors just a teeny bit, whereas zinc white is warmer. Wait, did I say permanent white was warmer? Hold on. Permanent white or titanium white is more opaque. Usually the paint itself is thicker as well, a little more of a paste. It tends to desaturate your colors just a tiny bit when you open them up with the white. Zinc white, on the other hand, is a little more transparent and tends not to desaturate your colors quite as much. It's a little on the warm side, so it's good for mixing with yellows to get really warm whites. Basically, the difference is not very large. It's mostly personal preference. Sometimes I just buy zinc white because it's on sale. And I feel like if you really want a white that covers stuff, get titanium white. You will be frustrated with zinc white. But if you're just using whites to mix with other colors, then either one is good. And it's just up to personal preference. I'm also going to be using a cadmium red or something similar. Gouache tends to come in more classic artist colors, which does include some toxic pigments like cadmium red. But basically, if you're using them on paintings, you're not running it down the sink, then you're using it responsibly. When I paint outdoors, which has not been as often as it used to be, I'd like to get more plein air paintings onto this channel, but frankly I just moved to a different sort of climate. Not too different, but it's hotter. The bugs are really, they think I'm delicious this year. But yeah, when I'm painting outdoors, I make sure not to dump any of my water if I've been cleaning a brush with cadmiums on it. I'll take it home instead and get it through the water treatment system rather than dumping it into the wild. I'll also be using Naples yellow, which is a bit of a cheaty color. I could just be using a yellow and a red, but I find Naples yellow is a really nice convenience color for painting skin tones. Doesn't matter what, what tone of skin tone. Naples yellow is going to be useful either for your mass tones, your local color, or it's going to be useful for your highlights. And then since this portrait will have gray hair, I'm also using neutral gray number 3, which is just another convenience color because I find that black in gouache is very dominant. and very neutral, whereas the neutral gray is actually on the warm side. I think, anyway. Sometimes it's like, if it's neutral enough, it's like, it could go either way, but I think it's on the warm side. And I mix it a lot with Payne's Gray, which makes it on the cool side. Which is why I'm squeezing out some more, because my blob of neutral gray has Payne's Gray all over it, as you can see in here. So if you guys are interested in an updated gouache collection, I guess, let me know. It's become a little more chaotic because I share my paints with my partner, who is also an artist. So our tubes are combined now, and it's just, they're not mine, they're ours. So if you'd like to see that, let me know, or if you'd like to see a watercolor collection video. I haven't done those in a couple years, so things have changed, but I have a lot. Maybe too many. Alright, so let's get this sort of situated here. I'll leave a little bit of the palette on the screen for this first section. I know you won't be able to see everything because otherwise we'd be zoomed out to like Saturn and you wouldn't be able to see the painting itself. But I'm going to start off by mixing, just in this little corner here, some of the Naples yellow with the titanium white. And I just realized I'm not using my gouache brush, so we're going to switch brushes as well. I prefer to use a filbert for gouache. It's more like a spatula, and I find it just puts the pigments down better. We'll switch back to the round brush when we're doing the details. You could also use just a flat brush, but I like the curve that filberts have. So for this one, I'm going to start by laying out the first wash of local color. I'm going to leave the eye clear for now. And then just adding a little more Naples yellow and a little more cadmium red to get some variation in the skin. And while it's still wet, it's much easier to blend, so I recommend doing this quite quickly if you can manage. If you live in a more humid climate, your paint will stay wet longer, or if you use a, I was going to use a stay wet palette, but it's not like it's a stay wet painting that you're painting on. If that makes sense. But anyway, so you want to get the variation in tone in there while you're laying down the first pass. And this is what I do for my client projects, because very often if there's a portrait, I am doing it in gouache. Gouache just, it scans nicely, it behaves nicely, it smells nice, it looks nice. I like gouache. But when I'm using my sketchbook just for fun, usually I use watercolor because it's faster. It's a little more simple, and then I don't end up spending absolutely forever in my sketchbook, because I'd rather spend absolutely forever on finished paintings. So that'll be the first wash for the face, and we'll let that dry. Gouache has a fairly pronounced difference in value when it dries. Sorry, I was like trying to talk and paint, man. Sometimes it's really hard. I'm getting better at it, but sometimes I still just like zone out mid-sentence. You know how it is, I'm sure. But yeah, gouache has quite a bit of a drying difference between values, so it'll either dry lighter or darker depending on what pigments are mixed into the mix. So it's good to let it just settle into the painting before you start mixing your shadows. And then for the hair, which is going to be gray, which I think is just so beautiful. My grandmother on my father's side, her hair went like white, like so white, like a beautiful fairy, and I hope I have that gene because I wouldn't mind having like badass fairy godmother type white hair. And as you can still see some of the color from the underpainting showing through the paint that I'm layering on now. And that is the point. That way you have a color that amplifies your painting showing through rather than just the white of the page, which might be distracting or make it look unfinished. And then for the coat, I think I'm going to go for a dark color and just pull in some Payne's gray. I'm not going to be too fussy about this. I kind of want some of the brush strokes to show through. I want to let the paint add its own voice to the portrait. Okay, so it's about dry. Gouache dries quite quickly. I'm going to move that over there. And we will start getting in some of the shadows on the face to begin with. And what you really want to do, and I'll mix it in this little section down here, is again using Naples, Cad Red, and the Titanium White. Get your peachy tone, and chances are this will dry a little bit darker. That's my hope anyway, so we'll see if it does that, and if it doesn't, no big deal because it's gouache and you can just go over it. So when doing portraits in profile, you have to remember that you have the cheekbone here going along right there behind the eye and into the brown bone. So you want to define the cheekbone more in a portrait facing either left or right in profile, because otherwise you get this big space of nothing on your portrait. And you can do that, you just have to pay more attention to the softness of the rendering. And again, this is, I guess, just how I do it. So I like to emphasize cheekbones. I think they're cool. I think they're attractive. And yeah, you just want to get in there and start carving out sections of the face. And if you're getting a little too dark, mix a lighter color and blend it in. You can also blend by reactivating the layer beneath, just with a clean-ish brush, and blend it in this way. Again, with the dramatic drying difference of gouache from wet to dry, sometimes it just looks freaking weird. Like right now, this looks pretty freaking weird because it's not dry. And so you'll just have to trust that you're putting down the right color and let it dry and see how it looks then, and then fix it. But I think that's going to do basically the right thing. I'm going to zoom you in a bit more now. Alright, and hopefully you can see better, and hopefully it's not too grainy. It's the sun keeps going behind clouds, and that really affects the graininess of the footage, which is too bad, but the clouds are pretty. So for the lips on older people, they tend to be a bit thinner, just due to the aging process, so I'm going to be very delicate about painting them. And that's getting there. Gonna get a little more gray into the hair now. And start defining the shaping of the hair. And again, it looks super weird because it's not dry. Okay, we're getting into some smaller details, so I'm switching brushes. I'm going to take a very thin amount of, this is a mix of phthalo and some other blues, and I mention it on this channel pretty much all the time, but my gouache palette is like the Wild West. There's no rules, but I know where everything is. So just going to take a little bit of that blue and use that to start getting some of the areas on the portrait to recede the way that I want them to. So the neck can go back, the hollow of the cheek can go back a little bit. The hollow of the eye socket can also go back a little bit. And you don't have to go too far, you know, you don't have to do too much to it. But just that little amount of blue coming into the portrait will help give it a little more dimension. So we're going to mix a slightly darker color now using Naples yellow, cadmium red, and some of the neutral gray. So this will create a slightly more neutral tone that I'm going to use to define some areas of the face, like the crow's feet wrinkles. Just sketching them in really nicely there. And the wrinkles under the nose and around the mouth. You can go more dramatic with the wrinkles, and your characters will look older and wiser, or you can keep them subtle and they'll look more youthful for their age. Really just depends what you're going for. But I showed this sketch to my partner, and he thought it was sort of like a wizard type character. And I think the model is a woman, and in the original picture that I'm coming from, she had this dramatic eye makeup, but I wanted to go a little more subtle, just how I felt. So she's sort of like a cool witch, like a Bene Gesserit or a teacher at Hogwarts or something. Because I love the high collar, it's super cool. And notice how I haven't got to the eyebrows yet? That's basically just because this is gouache. We'll get in there after. And gouache is really good for creating crisp lines and little details like that. So I'm really utilizing them for this portrait. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to start getting into some of the more dark colors, which includes the eye, which I'm just going to block out some of the pencil because I don't really need that anymore. And I'm going to mix a sort of darker neutral-y tone from the neutral gray number 3. Just mixing it with some raw sienna and some Payne's gray so that it doesn't lean too far warm or cool. I'm going to use this to further define the shape of the hair. And in gouache, you can see that I'm really using more of the line-based approach to the hair, but still treating it mostly as one whole big shape, the same as I did with the watercolor. So I'm just carving out the shape of her profile with this darker hair tone. This looks so cool. As well as defining the shape of the ear. And for ears, I do like to take the shadow color from the hair to do some of the detailing on the ear, because that helps it sort of integrate better and look less like there's like a disembodied ear in the hair, you know? Maybe that's weird. And gouache is really nice for dry brushing too, so if I can get some dry brushing into the hair, I might as well. Of course, it's damp brushing, not dry brushing. So again, we're gonna have to wait for the color to dry down before we know exactly what it's looking like. And now that we have a darker hair color, the eyebrows tend to be darker than the rest of the hair. It's just a contrast thing with the face. And this lady has some very nice arched eyebrows, so we'll get those in. And we'll get the eye in as well. And because most of this portrait is sort of lower in contrast, I'm not going to go full black with the eyes. I'm instead going more for a Payne's gray. Getting that in there with the lashes on the other side too. Get some Payne's gray in the nostril and at the corners of the mouth. Now, just because gouache is really good for this, I'm just doing a little bit of an illustrative line around some of the details. You don't have to do this, but at this point, like, I'm mostly just getting carried away because I love gouache. I really, like, nowadays I really only pull it out for finished pieces and client work, which sort of saves the oh my god, I love it for special occasions. Those special occasions, of course, being that I'm getting paid, I guess. All right, I think she's looking really awesome. I like the low contrast look around the mouth. I think I'm going to put a few more wrinkles in on the forehead. So I'm just picking up, again, some of that color I had before that's like a desaturated skin tone. Just putting a little more there. A little more in the hollow around the bridge of the nose. And now I'm just going to do a little bit of detailing on the jacket, nothing too fancy. I'm just going to go along the lapel with 2 lines, which will suggest top stitching, which is a tailoring technique that looks really good on lapels and such, I think anyway. Not everything's top stitched, but I just really like top stitching. I like doing it. I like wearing things that have it. And I'm also gonna go inside and make it a little bit darker where the shirt would be. All right. So that's how I paint portraits in gouache and watercolor. The last thing we need to do is get some specular highlights on some of these eyeballs. So I'm going to show you how I do that. And so when I wash my brush, I'm going to use a round brush, and then I twist it on the paper towel or the cloth that I use to dry it to get the pointiest point that I can. Then I take my white and I just stick the point right in there. I get a little bit of paint, just a little bit of paint, and I just poke it on there. Boop, done. Here's this guy. Boop, boop, done. And her. Boop, boop, done. Let me know if you thought this tutorial was helpful. Let me know also if you followed along. You can always tag me on Instagram at ThoughtsUpNorth, and I'll take a look at anything inspired by my art, by my channel, by my Instagram or Twitter platforms. I don't always respond because, I'll be honest with you, I'm an introvert, but I do look at everything. So here are all the finished portraits. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!